So in this exercise, we're going to take a look at weight painting, specifically weight painting, a simple sash mesh exported from Atelier into Blender and the clothing tools. So of course, first of all, we need to import our sash. Is there okay? No animation. Import FBX. So it's imported. We're checking the outliner, but it's small scaled, so it's hidden inside the cube. So we need to be in Object Properties, and we're just going to change the scaling. Change that to 1, 1, 1. And again, we now need to prep this. So select our mesh and or let's hide the cube. We can select all of this. And then Object, Parent, Clear and Keep Transform. That separates everything out. Select our mesh. Let's just rename this sash. Let's do that sash.mesh actually. Sash.mesh. Material preview to check the material is UV mapped, and it is. Whilst we're in Object Properties, let's enable wireframe so we can see the topology. That's our mesh. It's relatively dense for what we need for IMVU, but we'll stick with that for the moment. Let's check the shaders. This is the material. So there's our object. We've got our image. So this is a generated image from within Atelier. So what it's doing is if we change the color, if we go back to Atelier, if we select the material, and had we applied a texture color to this, go with blue, it will combine the color and the image to create a unique image that would have been included with the export to Blender. And in Blender, this would be now a unique image distinct from the original that was created and assigned to the sash. So we've also got a normal map. We don't necessarily need that, but we can leave that in. And then lastly, just take a quick look at the UV map. So this is what we've got. So the UV map is relative to the image's appearance on the mesh, not necessarily the UV map. So now that we've got all of that, let's save this. File, save as. Sash, raw, save. So clothing tool, new project, toolbar, clothing tool, pen clothing file. This was created with the female avatar, the default, so default female. Then all we need to do is append our mesh from our file. So sash raw, object folder, sash.mesh. Everything else is okay. Append. So that brings it in and exactly where it needs to be. So for weight painting, this needs to use several bones. So possibly shoulder to shoulder and then a neck bone down to the thigh bones. So ordinarily, to set this up, all we'd need to do is select our mesh and click on Bind to Armature. And this will create the link, the association between the mesh object and the armature or skeleton object, which will also then automatically assign various groups to the entire mesh relative to each of the bones. So if we do that, so select the mesh, bind to armature, that creates the connection or the link. So if we then click on pose, we can switch into pose mode, articulate the skeleton, and find that our mesh articulates with the avatar. But in doing so, there are a couple of issues that we need to be aware of. So if we move the arm again, we can see that this section at the bottom is moving with this. It shouldn't. Let's try the other side. That side's okay. Let's try the head. That's all right. Everything else seems to be okay. There might be some clipping in these extreme positions, but based on the design, this should be okay because we've made allowance for the avatar. So we need to correct this. Drop out of pose mode. Select our mesh. We want paint weights. What this will do is it'll switch the appearance of the mesh and drop us into object data properties, which gives us access to the vertex groups that are assigned. So these are the groups that are automatically assigned to the mesh when we click on bind to armature. So now if we select one of these are all the fingers. So if we go up to hand, we should start to see elbow, bicep, shoulder, clavicle. We see parts of the mesh displayed with colors. Now these colors are relative to influence. So the clavicle influences this large section of the mesh. It influences the red orange parts more than it does the pale blue parts. So the influence goes from red to blue. So this dark blue is 0 influence. This red is 100% influence. So what we need to do is remove the influence of whatever is affecting the mesh down at the bottom here. And that's possibly going to be a hand. So we're watching for colors. Let's click drag on that to make this a little larger. There it is, there's one. So if you take a closer look at that, we can see there is a slight color change. This has gone a slightly paler blue. That's no influence, so it's dark blue. That's gone pale. So to remove the influence, we select the group or highlight the group. And in this instance, we want to change the weight of the influence to 0. So click drag or type 0. And then we just paint over that section of the mesh. And we have to remove all of it to ensure that it's not distorting the mesh. So that looks okay. Toggle out of weight paint into pose mode, and we can check the mesh again. So select the wrist bone. There's still a little bit of influence. So those are possibly vertices that we've missed. Pose, select the mesh, paint weights. So what we can do to aid this process actually is pose the avatar, exit pose, paint weights, so we can see which ones are being influenced, and then we can just paint those out to flatten them. Like so. That one there, and that corner. The alternative to weight painting, which works better in this particular instance, so let's just weight paint all of that out, because although this means that there are no influences, we've painted them out, no influences on these particular vertices, the group, this group is still associated with this section of the mesh, which can cause issues. So a more succinct and finite way of fixing this problem, in this particular instance, exit paint weight, make sure the mesh is selected, enter edit mode, make sure nothing is selected, so select none, and then in vertex groups make sure our offending group is selected, and then what we can do is use the select and deselect buttons to highlight that group. So even though these have zero influence over the articulation and the deformation of the mesh, the group is still associated with the mesh. So we can highlight it and then remove. That will remove that influence over the mesh by that group. So if we deselect and then select, so highlight the group again to double check, it should select nothing. So now we go back into object mode, pose mode, we find that the arm has no influence over that section of the mesh anymore, because we've now not only nulled, we've zeroed out the influence, we've physically removed the vertex group that was linked to that section of the mesh. So that now functions the way that it should do. And in a nutshell, that is weight painting. Of course, for areas like that where we've got the extreme, so this is relatively speaking an extreme pose relative to the shape of the mesh, so we're going to get some clipping there. So that would then mean weight painting the mesh relative to these two bones to accommodate the butt clipping through the mesh. Select the mesh, paint weights, so that's going to be the hips. Left thigh, left hip, pelvis node. And this is where it gets tricky and or time consuming. So that didn't work. That's zeroing out the influence. So let's turn that to 1. We get pelvis pulling that out of shape, but we might not want to do that. So undo. Let's try left hip. Let's change the weight influence to 0.5. Paint that in and see how that deforms the mesh. 0.25. Because what we've got to avoid is capturing too much of the thigh in the hip. Let's try the thigh. Yeah, so if we reduce the thigh's influence over this section, it pulls it into shape. So we'll just do this roughly. Hip 0.5. That pulls that back into shape more or less. And then what we can do, let's just do that as 0.525. To smooth out the deformation of the mesh, what we can use is the blur tool. What that does is it blurs or softens the values across the mesh. While we're doing this, we want to keep it relative to the group that we are changing. So that's the hip. This is the thigh. That will smooth out the influence. Pelvis. You can do that as well. So hip, thigh. Let's increase the value there. So weight paint 0.5. 0.75. So that needs to be decreased. 0.25. Use blur. 0.25. Blur. Hip. 0.5. Blur. So that's the sash weight painted. So all we need to do now is just reset the pose, exit weight paint, reset the pose, and that's ready for export to IMVU. And for this, we want to include the torso sections and the sash. So select the torso parts first, sash last, shift click, and then just export. That will export everything. Then in Studio, new project, all women, female top, derive, and we'll just go through the import process just so that we can see how the weight painting is going to place the mesh on our avatar. So that's our avatar, import FBX, there's our mesh, open. Go through the import process, set up FBX. So we brought in the torso sections So that's the upper and lower. And we'll give a random ID to our mesh, to the sash. Next. There's our material. Next. No animation. Review. Import. It's going to assemble our mesh automatically with the missing avatar texture. So let's just turn on the MCG. Component, female skin, diffuse, and this should show all the parts that we need and our sash. And this is the weight painting fully set up, so it deforms properly with our avatar. So that's just a quick look at weight painting, specifically clothing items.